Hello, this is Brian, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 14th issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. U.S. restores blockade on Iran after its attacks on ships in the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. military said Tuesday that it has reimposed its blockade of Iranian ports in response to Iran's attacks on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, as the interim ceasefire deal unravels and concerns grow about a return to all-out war. The U.S. first imposed the blockade in mid-April and then lifted it in mid-June, a day after the signing of the interim deal aimed at permanently ending the war. The deal set a 60-day timeline to also negotiate an agreement on Iran's nuclear program, but talks have stalled as fighting over the strait has intensified. When U.S. President Donald Trump announced the return of the blockade Monday, he also said he would impose a 20% fee on ships passing through the strait, but he dropped the plan to collect fees hours before resuming the blockade, citing requests from allies in the Gulf. The interim peace agreement was supposed to reopen a waterway that is key to world energy supplies and give negotiators time to hammer out a permanent end to the war. Instead, fighting has once again engulfed the region, threatened the global economy, and brought warnings to commercial airlines. The U.S. carried out another wave of strikes ahead of reimposing the blockade, a U.S. official told the Associated Press, on condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive military operation. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister for Legal and International Affairs, Qasem Garibabadi, said in an interview aired Tuesday by IRIB, Iran's state broadcaster, that the U.S. was seeking to prevent Tehran from exercising what he described as effective sovereignty over the strait. There are at least 19 U.S. warships in the Arabian Sea, including 2 aircraft carriers and an amphibious assault ship with more than 1,000 Marines aboard. U.S. Central Command also said in a social media post that there are hundreds of military aircraft operating across the Middle East. A fifth of all traded crude oil and natural gas passed through the Strait of Hormuz before the war, when it was open to all without tolls. When the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th, it effectively shut the passage by attacking and threatening ships. That sent the price of oil, fertilizer, and other goods soaring. Iran has more recently attacked ships moving through the strait on a route overseen by the U.S. military that is outside Tehran's control, setting off tit-for-tat strikes. The U.S. has threatened to reopen the strait by force, but experts say that would require a much bigger armada, if not tens of thousands of ground troops. Trump says he's replacing the fees with Gulf investments. Trump said Tuesday that he was called by kings and emirs and other leaders who suggested an alternate arrangement to charging ships fees to pass through the strait. They said, "We'd love to do it a different way. We'd love to invest in the United States with billions and billions of dollars," Trump told reporters Tuesday in the Oval Office. Trump said he preferred that arrangement to charging tolls because "I don't think anybody should be able to charge a fee for the strait." It was unclear if the investment deals would be new commitments relative to what Trump announced after a visit last year to the Middle East. Strikes and counterstrikes resume across the Mideast. The U.S. military's Central Command said it struck several areas in Iran, targeting coastal defense systems, missile and drone sites, and maritime capabilities. Iran acknowledged the strikes, but provided no immediate casualty or damage assessments. These strikes will continue imposing a heavy cost on Iranian forces and degrade their ability to attack innocent civilians and commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. military said. Iranian state media Tuesday reported the sounds of explosions on Qasem Island in the strait, alongside additional explosions in the southwestern city of Avaz and the port city of Bandar Abbas. Iran responded with attacks targeting Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and 3 tankers that traveled through the strait. The International Maritime Organization said the attack killed 2 mariners and wounded 14 others on 2 of the tankers, Mombasa and Al Bahia, which were associated with the United Arab Emirates. The UAE threatened to retaliate. Qatar called for diplomacy Tuesday and condemned what it described as repeated Iranian attacks on Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait, calling them an egregious violation of the 3-country sovereignty and the international rules-based order. Hours after the U.S. said it ended its campaign of strikes, the Iranian city of Bushehr on the Persian Gulf was hit in at least 4 locations, the state-run IRNA news agency reported. Explosions in the southwestern city of Avaz and the southern port city of Bandar Abbas also were reported by Iranian state media on Tuesday evening. The attacks again raised the possibility that Gulf Arab states were retaliating against Iran without discussing it in public. The interim peace deal is in peril. Exchanges of fire in recent days had already cast doubt on the interim peace deal, now almost halfway through the 60-day period in which negotiators were supposed to agree to a final accord, which also was meant to address Iran's disputed nuclear program and other issues. The passage of vessels is not important to the U.S. The U.S. is not dependent on the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump has announced it many times, Gharibabadi, Iran's deputy foreign minister, said in an interview aired Tuesday by IRIB. It was not immediately clear when the interview was recorded. Trump's plan to charge fees would have been a change to long-standing U.S. policy and a departure from U.S. promises that the strait would remain open to all without tolls, recently offered by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on a trip to the region. Under the interim deal, Iran agreed that passage through the strait would remain free of charge for 60 days, but the agreement left open what would happen after. Iran asserts it has the right to manage traffic and potentially charge fees. The U.S. has disputed that. The price for a barrel of Brent crude oil, international standard, briefly topped $87 early Tuesday, still well below the nearly $120 reached at the height of the war. The price dipped to $78 in the aftermath of Trump's announcement that he had changed course. Mediators are trying to prevent a return to full-scale war. Regional mediators are still trying to get the United States and Iran back to the negotiating table, according to 2 regional officials. The officials, speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss the delicate diplomatic process, said Pakistan-led mediation was working around the clock to reactivate the ceasefire. Meanwhile, Lebanese and Israeli delegations met Tuesday in Rome and will continue U.S.-mediated negotiations Wednesday. Shortly after the U.S. and Israel launched the war on February 28th, the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah joined the conflict in support of its ally Iran and began attacking Israel. Israel responded with a ground invasion of Lebanon. Last month, Lebanon and Israel announced a framework agreement outlining the withdrawal of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon in exchange for the disarmament of Hezbollah. Implementation has stalled. Trump administration orders ICE to suspend most vehicle stops after 2 deadly shootings. Trump administration officials told Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers to suspend most vehicle stops after 2 deadly shootings within a week, people familiar with the decision said Tuesday. The policy change came after an ICE officer shot and killed a Colombian driver Monday in Maine, and a week after one shot and killed a motorist in Houston, renewing criticism of the agency's enforcement tactics that were widely condemned last winter after the killings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good in Minnesota. In Florida on Tuesday, a third man in roughly a week died during an encounter with immigration officers. This time, a 28-year-old man was killed after he was hit by a tractor trailer while running from immigration and other federal officers, authorities said. The suspension of vehicle stops allows room for exceptions when executing a criminal warrant or working with partner agencies, according to a person who spoke Tuesday on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive law enforcement operations. Matthew Felling, a spokesperson for Maine Senator Angus King, said the senator's office was also told by the Department of Homeland Security that ICE was suspending stops. Hundreds of people in Maine protested Tuesday over the fatal shooting of Johann Sebastian Duran Guerrero, a 26-year-old Colombian national. DHS said Monday that an officer, fearing for public safety, shot and killed Duran Guerrero while officers were watching the home of someone they believed was in the U.S. illegally and facing a final order of removal from the country. It said in a post on X that when ICE tried to stop a car driven by someone who came from the home, the vehicle attempted to flee and the officer fired. That was a shift from how King earlier described the encounter, when he said Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen told him the officer opened fire after the man tried to use his vehicle as a weapon. King said Mullen told him the officers were trying to serve an arrest warrant, but not for the man who was shot. DHS, which oversees ICE, didn't respond to an email seeking clarity on what led to the shooting. In a scathing post on X, outgoing Colombian President Gustavo Petro called the shooting a targeted killing at the hands of the U.S. government. Petro, who has openly quarreled with U.S. President Donald Trump, urged Trump to provide an explanation and accused ICE officers of treating Duran Guerrero as an inferior being without rights. The shooting also sparked outrage in Maine, where hundreds of protesters gathered Tuesday outside an ICE detention center in Scarborough, just up the coast between Biddeford and Portland. These people are killers and they must leave our state now, organizer Todd Schretin told the crowd, including some who held signs reading, "Stop the murder and end this terror." Maine's congressional delegation on Tuesday demanded a comprehensive, transparent, and expedited investigation. Questions surround the shooting. Duran Guerrero's shooting marked at least the 9th time ICE has used deadly force since Trump began his immigration crackdown. Photos showed bullet holes in Duran Guerrero's car's windshield, but the officers involved in the shooting didn't have body cameras, leaving many questions. Among them are how close the officer was to the vehicle when they fired, whether officers told Duran Guerrero to stop, and why ICE believes he had put the public in danger. We are always evaluating our procedures to keep our officers safe and criminals off our streets. We will not disclose or discuss law enforcement tactics, an ICE spokesperson said in a statement. Maine's Attorney General's office, which noted that it's working with federal agencies to investigate, said initial statements suggest the driver was trying to flee in the direction of the officer, whose name hasn't been released and who was placed on leave. The state's other senator, Republican Susan Collins, said Mullen told her that the DHS's Office of Inspector General is investigating in cooperation with the FBI. Democrats seeking to unseat Collins in November sought Tuesday to connect her with the public's unease over ICE's methods. Collins later said in a statement that although ICE needs to improve, eliminating the agency would make the nation less safe. Video shows the shooting's aftermath. According to neighbors and public records, Guerrero lived in an apartment about 150 feet from where his car came to a rest outside an apartment building across the street from a pawn shop and laundromat. Video from a nearby business's security camera obtained by the AP shows a white car slowly approaching an intersection before making several circles. A law enforcement SUV blocks its path, and two officers open the driver's door and drag out a limp body. It isn't clear from the video when the shots were fired. Daniel Buscher said he heard a pop, pop, pop and ran to the intersection. His face was bloody. His head was bloody, Buscher said. I clearly heard the victim say, I tried to stop. Buscher said the officer who shot Duran Guerrero walked close to him. He looked at me and said, he tried to run me over, or something to that effect, Buscher said. I don't remember his exact words. Duran Guerrero is survived by his wife and young daughter. Two advocacy groups, the Maine Immigrants' Rights Coalition and Presente, said Duran Guerrero was authorized to work in the U.S. Neighbors say Duran Guerrero was a friendly and familiar face, even though they rarely chatted because he didn't appear to speak English. Sadie Dilboy and Corey Paulin, who owns the laundromat near the intersection, said they saw Duran Guerrero all the time. Everyone knows him, said Dilboy, who remembered that he often came to their store with his daughter and gave her quarters to buy candy. Claudia Morton, who often waved to Duran Guerrero, was distraught. The whole world should be crying, she said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Senators rally to Russia sanctions bill, one of Graham's top priorities. Senator Lindsey Graham's pursuit of a Russian sanctions bill has taken on renewed urgency after his death, as colleagues look to pay tribute and build on the progress he made in gaining the White House's support for the measure. Supporters of Ukraine have been working for more than a year to pass a bill that would impose steep tariffs on goods from countries that continue to buy Russian oil, gas, and other exports. They unveiled a revised measure Tuesday with the goal of depriving Russia of money it uses to fund its war against Ukraine. Some lawmakers worried the original bill was too broad and could harm the economies of some of the U.S.'s strongest allies that have also helped Ukraine. The White House wanted to ensure the president had adequate flexibility to waive sanctions when it is the national interest to do so. The revised bill attempts to address both concerns. The final bill more narrowly applies the tariffs to the world's top 5 purchasers of Russia oil or natural gas, according to a summary. China and India are at the top of that list, sponsors said. It also dramatically reduces the tariffs from a blanket 500% to up to 100%, and it provides exceptions for countries that import less than 15% of their natural gas from Russia and are taking steps to reduce those imports. Graham and colleagues who had been working on the legislation issued a statement Friday announcing that significant progress had been made in talks with the Trump administration. The senator passed away late Saturday before the revised bill could be unveiled. Graham had just returned from Ukraine and discussed the sanctions bill with President Donald Trump in a call shortly before his death. Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat, Connecticut, who was working with Graham on the legislation, said he would be in favor of naming the bill after Graham. It's part of his legacy, Blumenthal said. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer called Monday on Senate Majority Leader John Thune to bring the bill to the floor immediately in honor of Lindsey, saying it will pass overwhelmingly and help our allies in Ukraine. Thune said he was hopeful we can make that happen. It would certainly be an incredible legacy for him if, in fact, we can find a path forward. It'll take Democrats and Republicans here in the Senate to do that, Thune said on CNN. The bill has support from more than 24 senators so far, and aides said the list was growing. The House passed a much different bill last month that included more than $1 billion in security and reconstruction aid for Ukraine, as well as making another $8 billion available for Ukraine's defense through loans. Blumenthal said he spoke with Graham last week about the progress he had made in talks with the White House. He was absolutely ecstatic. I've never heard him quite as exuberant. Graham traveled to Ukraine last week and offered the country reason to be optimistic, telling reporters that sweeping, hard-hitting new economic sanctions against Russia were finally within reach. He said he would be heading back to Washington to meet with bipartisan leaders to advance the proposal. Democratic members of U.S. Congress visit Cuba and compare a U.S. energy embargo to silent Gaza. 4 Democratic members of U.S. Congress who traveled to Cuba this weekend described the energy embargo imposed on the island by U.S. President Donald Trump as turning the island into a silent Gaza. The U.S. implemented the energy embargo in January after the capture of Venezuela's then-president, Nicolas Maduro, and threatened tariffs on other countries that sell fuel to the island. The measures have exacerbated a 5-year crisis caused by previous sanctions and failed domestic policies such as monetary unification. Representatives Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, Teresa Leger Fernandez of New Mexico, Maxine Dexter of Oregon, and Delia Catalina Ramirez of Illinois arrived Thursday for a visit that included meeting with President Miguel Diaz-Canel and lasted until Monday. This is the second trip by representatives in 3 months. They also met with ministers, medical professionals, and business leaders and toured the streets of Havana, they told journalists. However, they clarified that there are currently no talks between Washington and Havana when asked about progress in the bilateral dialogue to lift the energy embargo. I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio is making this personal and not professional, Pocan said. Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants and grew up in Miami, where he began his political career under the strong influence of anti-Castro exile groups. Both governments have acknowledged on several occasions that there has been contact between their officials, but it's unclear when the 2 countries last met. Neither country has offered details on the talks. Recently, the grandson of the 95-year-old socialist leader Raul Castro, Colonel Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, offered himself as an intermediary with Trump. He secretly met with Rubio on the sidelines of a Caribbean Community Summit in St. Kitts in February. Trump and Rubio have indicated that they hope the embargo will strangle the island's government, which they accuse of being inefficient. Cuban authorities have denounced it as collective punishment. On the streets, the consequences are palpable. Blackouts lasting more than 20 hours a day, limited public transportation, flight cancellations, a drop in tourism, reduced working hours, and a general paralysis of domestic life. Lawmakers condemn the impact of the energy blockade. According to Pocan, someone he spoke with in Cuba described the current situation as a silent Gaza, which he considered an apt description. There may not be bombings, but there are certainly conditions that prevent people from going about their daily lives. They can't go to work, they can't preserve their food, they can't access medical supplies, or live as they did before, he said. Leger Fernandez said, "It doesn't make any sense at all to force a country to suffer." Dexter, who is also a trained physician, and Ramirez said they will seek to promote amendments in Congress to mitigate the health impact and prevent further action by Trump without legislative authorization, such as the armed operations that he repeatedly threatened. Majority of new Ebola cases in eastern Congo are from unknown chains as outbreak outpaces response. 80% of new Ebola cases in eastern Congo are emerging from unknown chains of transmission, the World Health Organization said Tuesday, a sign the outbreak is spreading faster than health officials can track despite an expanding response. Congo has been battling an outbreak of a rare type of Ebola since May, with no approved treatment or vaccine. The Africa Centers for Disease Control says it is the fastest growing Ebola outbreak on the continent. Perhaps the most alarming finding is that many of the newly reported deaths are people who died in their communities without ever reaching a health facility and without receiving care, Chikwe Ikwezu said after returning from Bunia in Ituri province, one of the worst hit cities. And as of today, 80% of new cases are outside our contact lists and so are coming to us from unknown chains of transmission. People who die outside the health system cannot be isolated, treated, or have their contacts traced promptly, increasing the risk of further transmission. The outbreak, Ikwezu said, continues to outpace the response efforts. As of Monday, at least 1,926 people have been infected, of whom 702 have died in 3 provinces in Congo from the rare Bundibugyo virus, Congolese authorities said. Cases have also been confirmed in neighboring Uganda. Ikwezu told reporters in Geneva that his visit to Bunia had been quite encouraging on many fronts, but also deeply concerning. Treatment capacity in Bunia is now close to 800 beds, with capacity increasing every week, and lab capacity has grown from 1 to 14 labs, an effort the emergency chief lauded. However, Ikwezu said that despite our best efforts, we have not caught up in the race. A funding gap, attacks on health centers, an ongoing conflict in eastern Congo, and mistrust among local communities have hampered the response. Dozens of healthcare workers at an Ebola virus treatment center in northeast Congo went on strike over unpaid salaries and bonuses on Monday. On Tuesday, they agreed to resume work under the condition that the government pays them within 72 hours. Just one day of strike action has already caused damage. Patients were unable to access the center, the striking health workers said in a statement. We hold the government solely responsible for any loss of life if the site closes after this ultimatum. The Congolese authorities declared a fresh Ebola outbreak on May 15th after the disease had been transmitting for weeks without official detection, according to the WHO. Clinical trials for treatment began last week after researchers launched a highly anticipated study in the hope of fighting the virus. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said on July 11th that a U.S. citizen working for a humanitarian organization in Congo has tested positive for the Ebola virus without providing further details. Caribbean leaders press for slavery reparations, end of island's territorial status. A group of Caribbean leaders met with senior clergy from the Church of England on Tuesday as the push for slavery reparations intensifies, with activists also calling for the independence of British, French, Dutch, and U.S. territories in the region. The Reparations Commission from CARICOM, a Caribbean trade bloc, was scheduled to also meet with British parliamentarians as part of a 4-day official trip to the United Kingdom to seek reparations, the second such trip since November. The group said the Commission is creating a framework to launch negotiations because the time for making the case for reparatory justice is overdue. We in the Caribbean remain the most colonized part of the world, and this has to stop, said Hilary Beckles, chairman of CARICOM's Reparations Commission and vice chancellor of the University of the West Indies. The meetings in London come after Caribbean leaders bristled at the recent suggestion by a UK lawmaker that Britain's former colonies should repay it for its historic investment in them. The Commission noted that the Caribbean has at least 20 territories with ties to Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States. I am quite sure the people of the Caribbean will be looking to see whether their king is going to advance this conversation about sovereignty decolonization, and reparatory justice for these crimes that have been committed, Beckles said. David Commission, Barbados ambassador to CARICOM, echoed those comments, stressing that the first step of reparations must be the recovery of national sovereignty and self-determination. He said the commission had a productive meeting with 3 senior clerics from the Church of England, calling it a possible ally. He also praised King Charles III for expressing in recent years personal sorrow at the suffering of so many, as he noted slavery's enduring impact. However, Commission and others criticized the United Kingdom for abstaining from a UN resolution passed in March that called for reparations and declared the trafficking of enslaved Africans the gravest crime against humanity. All 27 members of the European Union also abstained, while Argentina, Israel, and the United States voted against the resolution. Commission noted that some European governments have offered apologies, memorials, museums, and the preservation of slavery infrastructure on Africa's west coast. These are some preliminary gestures that we appreciate, he said, but those gestures are not negotiations. The damage that was done and that still exists today was so consequential, so deeply rooted that it goes way beyond gestures of memorialization. An estimated 12 million Africans were forcefully taken by European nations from the 16th to the 19th century, and those who survived the trip across the Atlantic Ocean were enslaved on plantations in the Caribbean and elsewhere under brutal conditions. Commission members spoke during a press conference in London ahead of the meeting with parliamentarians. Among the questions was whether the Commission would publish rules as to who should receive reparations. The answer for the Caribbean remains unclear, although Ron Daniels, head of the National African American Reparations Commission, said talks in the United States have centered on land, economic development, and the restoration or building of communications and healthcare infrastructure. Reparations is proceeding quite effectively in the United States as a blueprint, Daniels said. CARICOM leaders are seeking a formal apology, education and public health improvements, development programs for indigenous people, repatriation and resettlement for those seeking to live in their homeland, debt cancellations, and monetary compensations, among other things. In early September, Jamaica's government is expected to file a formal petition asking King Charles III to refer legal questions on slavery reparations to the Privy Council, the island's final court of appeal. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Ukraine downs 5 Russian ballistic missiles as Kiev looks to boost its air defenses. Ukraine's Air Force said Tuesday it intercepted 5 ballistic missiles launched by Russia in a raft of overnight attacks, although other missiles and drones got through and hit warehouses and a school in the capital of Kiev. It was the first time in almost 2 weeks that Ukraine said it had downed Russian ballistic missiles, which are harder to stop than drones or cruise missiles, and have pummeled the country in Moscow's 4-year-old full-scale invasion. Ukrainian air defenses likely used the U.S.-made Patriot surface-to-air guided missile system that is the most effective way of countering ballistic missiles, but ammunition for it has been in short supply amid the Iran war, despite European efforts to make up for the shortfall. Paris cheers Ukraine along the Champs-Élysées. Along the cobblestone Champs-Élysées in Paris, crowds cheered Ukrainian troops marching in the annual Bastille Day parade, and President Volodymyr Zelensky received an ovation from European leaders who showed solidarity with Kiev. Ukrainian aviators trained in France flew aboard two Mirage 2000B fighter jets alongside French Air Force pilots. Zelensky was in France seeking a remedy to his country's air defense problem, and he announced Monday that Ukraine is joining with 9 other nations to form a coalition that will build a shared ballistic missile shield for Europe. Ukraine and its partners could jointly develop a mass-produced, low-cost system in the next 12 months, he said. The Bastille Day parade featured about 500 troops from the Coalition of the Willing, group of countries that have pledged to help with Ukraine's post-war security. French President Emmanuel Macron called it a great honor to welcome them to the parade. Tuesday's attack in Kiev caused fires at 2 warehouses and also damaged a school, Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement it targeted military manufacturing facilities that produce long-range missiles and drones. Moscow is seeking to choke off Ukrainian strikes on oil facilities deep inside Russia that have caused critical fuel shortages, frustrating the public, and Western analysts say are hindering the Russian army's advance on the front line. Ukraine's Air Force said 1 ballistic missile and 25 drones struck 17 locations, while falling debris was reported in 10 locations. Ukraine seeks to bolster air defenses ahead of winter. Ukraine urgently needs to improve its air defense shield before winter. Much of the country is at the mercy of Russian missiles that have hammered its power grid since 2022, making winters almost unbearable. President Donald Trump said at the NATO summit last week that the U.S. will give Ukraine a license to make Patriot systems itself. However, they are expensive, in high demand, and take a long time to produce, so it will likely be years before any Ukrainian-made systems are ready to deploy. Ukraine strikes more Russian oil facilities. Ukraine, meanwhile, kept up its long-range onslaught on Russian targets, especially oil facilities. An attack in southern Russia's Krasnodar region caused a fire at the Afipsky oil refinery that was later put out, authorities there said. Zelensky said Ukraine also hit an oil refinery in the city of Salavat in the Bashkortostan region, some 900 miles from the Ukrainian border. Bashkortostan Governor Rady Kabirov confirmed an attack on an industrial area in Salavat, but didn't say what was hit. In addition, the Ukrainian Navy struck 4 Russian tankers operating as part of Moscow's so-called shadow fleet of aging tankers of uncertain ownership and safety practices that are dodging international oil sanctions and a patrol boat, Zelensky said. Ukraine claimed Monday it struck 105 Russian vessels in the Sea of Azov next to the Crimean Peninsula between July 6th through the 13th. The Russian Defense Ministry said its air defenses overnight intercepted 288 Ukrainian drones. Russian President Vladimir Putin has rebuffed ceasefires offered by Zelensky. This war must be brought to an end, and all reasonable diplomatic proposals are on the table, Zelensky said on social media. 1,000 evacuated from Fontainebleau fires near Paris. Spanish authorities identify some fire victims. Hundreds of firefighters battled 2 blazes Tuesday in the Fontainebleau forest south of Paris that have consumed nearly 4,900 acres and forced the evacuation of 1,000 people, local authorities said. Bigger fires have been ravaging areas of southern France, but the Fontainebleau fire is exceptionally close to the densely populated region surrounding the French capital. Water-dumping planes repeatedly dived into the Seine River to scoop up water and douse the fires the first time such aircraft had ever been used to fight fires in the Paris region, the regional fire chief said. Smoke blanketed the treetops and hung in the air Tuesday as authorities sought to get the fires under control. No deaths or injuries have been reported. 2 arrested in connection with Fontainebleau fires. 2 people have been arrested in connection with the Fontainebleau fires and 2 others arrested for fires elsewhere in France, Interior Minister Laurent Nunez said Tuesday on BFM television. He didn't provide details. The heat wave that has scorched France in recent days, the 3rd already this year, is starting to subside. The National Weather Service expects to end its heat wave red alert warning starting Wednesday, though thunderstorm warnings are now in place in several regions. Spanish authorities identify some victims of deadly fire. 4 days after a fire ravaged a remote expat community in southern Spain, judicial authorities have identified 10 of the 13 fatalities using biological samples. Most of the deceased, all of whom were adults, are foreign nationals. They include 5 British citizens, including a woman who died in the hospital, 3 Belgian nationals, a French woman, and a Spanish national, judicial authorities said in a statement late Monday. 10 people remain unaccounted for. The Los Gallardos fire affected some 27 square miles of forest and farmland, an area larger than Manhattan. Spain is expecting extreme heat, which combined with wind and little rainfall, is creating the ideal conditions for small wildfires to grow unchecked. Europe is the world's fastest warming continent, with temperatures increasing twice as fast as the global average since the 1980s, according to the European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service. 26 Meta employees sue, alleging AI-driven layoff picks hit workers on medical and parental leave. A group of 26 Meta employees has sued the company, claiming it used artificial intelligence systems to select people for layoffs, disproportionately targeting those on medical, parental, or family leave. They are among the 8,000 employees, or about 10% of its workforce, Meta said it would lay off in May. The lawsuit filed late Monday in federal court in Oakland, California, claims the company used internal AI systems, keystroke and activity monitoring data, AI token usage dashboards, and algorithmically assisted performance rankings, among other methods, to determine who would be laid off. Many of these scores and ratings, by design, cannot be accumulated by an employee who is on protected medical or family leave or whose output is reduced by a disability, the lawsuit says. Meta, according to the lawsuit, did not account for protective leave when taking employees' scores into account and did not pause the system for the individualized leave and accommodation neutral review that the law requires. As a result, people on protected medical or family leave were disproportionately selected for layoffs, the lawsuit says. Each of the 26 anonymous employees in the lawsuit took protective leave and requested or received a reasonable accommodation for disability. Though they have been notified of their layoffs, all 26 remain employed by Meta, with separation set to begin July 22nd. Many workers were on parental leave. Many of the employees in the lawsuit took pregnancy or parental leave, during which time they wouldn't have worked and thus had their measured output reduced. Others took medical leave. One disclosed a serious health condition and disability that was approved by Meta's own provider. But according to the lawsuit, he was discouraged and deterred from taking that leave by a manager who warned that doing so would result in his selection for the anticipated layoffs. Meta offered no accommodation for his disability, the lawsuit says. Meta said in a statement that the claims lack merit and are not based on facts workforce management, and organizational decisions were and are made by people, not AI. About half the plaintiffs had taken leave for caregiving or pregnancy-related reasons. 8 are women who had taken maternity or pregnancy-related leave. 4 are men who had taken parental leave, and 1 is a woman who had taken leave to care for a family member and later bereavement leave. The lawsuit says the layoffs violated several state and federal laws, including the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. The lawsuit cites disparate impact. The complaint also references disparate impact liability, a long-standing civil rights concept that President Donald Trump's administration moved to abandon. Disparate impact, codified in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, holds that facially neutral policies or practices can be discriminatory if they disproportionately burden a protected class of workers and aren't necessary for the job. The Trump administration has ordered federal agencies to deprioritize disparate impact liability enforcement, arguing that its use undermines meritocracy and encourages the assumption that any racial or gender imbalance in the workforce is the result of discrimination. The order has led the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to drop discrimination cases on behalf of some workers. However, the lawsuit against Meta underscores that companies remain vulnerable to disparate impact litigation in the age of AI, despite the Trump administration's efforts to stamp out its enforcement. Workers are still free to pursue such lawsuits on their own if the EEOC rejects their complaints, and several state laws specifically prohibit disparate impact discrimination. In the case against Meta, lawyers for the plaintiffs argued that the company's algorithmically assisted selection process, by systematically recording such absences as reduced performance, falls more heavily on women than on men. That's because women disproportionately take pregnancy and caregiving leave, according to the lawyers. The lawsuit cites Title VII's prohibition on employment practices that have a disparate impact, as well as a landmark 1971 Supreme Court ruling that recognized the doctrine. The plaintiff's lawyer said in a statement that the lawsuit asks for one thing: preserving the status quo to keep the workers employed pending arbitration. That's because once these separations are final, the harms are irreversible. Employer-subsidized health coverage lost during pregnancy, postpartum recovery, and active medical treatment, time-bound leave rights extinguished, and vested equity forfeited, and immigration consequences triggered. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Mexico asks U.S. state attorneys general investigate migrant deaths in ICE custody. Mexico formally requested that U.S. state attorneys general criminally investigate cases of migrants who have died in immigration and customs enforcement custody or during raids, the Mexican government said Tuesday. The request follows the death of Mexican immigrant Lorenzo Salgado Araujo, who was shot and killed by an ICE agent in Houston. Since the beginning of U.S. President Donald Trump's second term, 17 Mexican migrants have died during immigration enforcement, 14 in ICE custody, and 3 in agency operations. Mexico's foreign ministry had previously said it would make the request, which was formalized on Tuesday, according to the ministry. It said a similar request will be also sent to the U.S. Department of Justice. The United States is not legally obliged to act on the request. Also, the Mexican government said it has started sending letters to U.S. detention centers where Mexican migrants have died, demanding they immediately cease the actions or omissions that resulted in these deaths, such as preventing access to prompt and expedited medical care, as well as the application of policies incompatible with medical and penitentiary standards. The first center to receive the letter was Adelanto in California, where 4 Mexican migrants died. The letters are a first step toward the eventual filing of civil lawsuits against the companies that operate the detention centers to stop human rights violations, according to the ministry. Last week, Mexican Foreign Minister Roberto Velasco said his country would go directly to U.S. authorities to request criminal investigations in cases of Mexicans killed in ICE custody or enforcement operations. Salgado Araujo, who had no criminal record and had lived in the U.S. for 35 years, was shot last Tuesday while driving his construction crew to a job site in Houston. His death sparked protests in Houston and demands for an independent investigation from Democrats and Salgado Araujo's family. The Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE, said 52-year-old Salgado Araujo had rammed an ICE vehicle and that a federal agent fired a weapon in self-defense. Velasco also sent a letter to Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, requesting that U.S. authorities gather information on the deaths of the Mexican migrants in ICE custody and analyze the compatibility of these events with international human rights obligations. The foreign minister also asked Turk to seek the opinion of the Human Rights Council, a UN intergovernmental body that promotes human rights worldwide, on the cases and offer recommendations. The developments mark an escalation in Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum's response to Trump's immigration crackdown. Sheinbaum earlier this year ordered Mexico's diplomatic missions across the U.S. to regularly check in with ICE detainees, and her government even lodged a complaint with Turk. Yemen at risk of getting dragged back into war as Saudis and Houthis exchange airstrikes. A truce that ended nearly a decade of war in Yemen has mostly held since 2022. It is being severely tested 4 years later as tensions tied to the war in Iran risk spilling over. The civil war in Yemen that began in 2014 eventually pitted Iran-backed Houthi rebels against a Saudi-led coalition supporting the country's government. While the Iran war that began on February 28th reignited all sorts of regional rivalries, the peace between the Houthis and Saudis had mostly prevailed until Monday. That's when Houthis launched missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia's Abha International Airport in response to airstrikes on Sana'a International Airport earlier in the day that they blamed on Saudi Arabia. No casualties were reported, but it was the most significant confrontation between these enemies in years, raising fears that they could be moving closer to another war. Yemen, one of the world's poorest countries, is still recovering from the civil war that plunged parts of the nation into famine. Here's a closer look at the renewed tensions. A flight from Iran triggered the fighting. Yemen's civil war began in 2014 when the Houthis seized the capital, Sana'a, and much of northern Yemen and forced the government into exile. A Saudi-led coalition intervened the following year to try to restore the government to power. The country is now divided between the Houthi-controlled north and a southern region mostly ruled by the internationally recognized government. Tensions began to flare earlier this month when the Houthis accused Saudi Arabia of trying to prevent an Iranian plane from carrying a Houthi delegation to Tehran for the funeral of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. When the plane returned to Yemen on Monday, Saudi Arabia attacked the Sana'a airport to prevent it from landing, the Houthis said. The plane was diverted, and landed safely at another airport. Saudi Arabian officials did not respond to a request for comment about the airstrikes in Yemen. Rashad al-Alami, who leads Yemen's internationally recognized government, said it had rejected a request from Iran to return the Houthi delegation. He accused the rebel group of receiving the Iranian flight outside the legal and sovereign frameworks governing civil aviation. On Tuesday, Houthi military spokesman Brigadier General Yahya Saree said the Houthis are prepared to confront any violation of Yemen's airspace. He said on Telegram that the group downed a Saudi reconnaissance aircraft at dawn in Al Baida province in central Maine. There are deeper issues at play. Ahmed Naji, a senior Yemen analyst at the International Crisis Group, said Monday's exchange of fire was about more than a single Iranian flight. Saudi Arabia and Yemen's internationally recognized government viewed the flight as an attempt to weaken their control over Yemen's airspace. The Saudi-led coalition imposed an air and sea blockade in Yemen in 2015 to put pressure on the Houthis by allowing a direct international flight to land without the approval of the Saudi-led coalition. The Houthis were seeking to establish a new reality in which they could independently make decisions over Yemen's airspace and end what they view as a blockade of the international airport. The Houthis were testing a new red line. If they succeeded, they could become more emboldened, raise their demands, and seek to cross additional red lines, Naji said. Farai al-Muslimi, a research fellow at the Chatham House think tank in London, said Saudi Arabia has so far shown restraint in the broader U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, but it is far less likely to stay on the sidelines when it perceives its influence in Yemen, which borders Saudi Arabia to the south, to be under threat. Could the exchange signal further regional instability? It is too early to say whether Monday's confrontation will lead to further escalation or was just an isolated incident. But Abdel Bari Taher, a political analyst in Yemen, said the country's fragile security and economic landscape provides fertile ground for renewed conflict and regional power competition. The region now is in a state of an all-out confrontation, he said. Yemen provides a conflict-prone environment because it's divided with militias fighting each other and lacks full control over its maritime and airspace. Yemen also risks getting dragged into the broader conflict. The Iran-backed Houthis have carried out numerous missile attacks against Israel throughout the war, and the rebel group has a history of attacking ships in the Red Sea, disrupting international trade. Taher said Iran might try to use its Houthi allies as a way to gain negotiating leverage against the U.S. An interim ceasefire is on life support as the U.S. and Iran fight for control over the Strait of Hormuz, and the risks are rising of a return to an all-out war. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 14th issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Brian. Thank you for listening.